The Twitter Files Part 2 are out. Barry Weiss has dropped the second thread, and this one is even more interesting than the first one. Although, I have to give a little bit of a caveat because when I talked about it in my first video, there was some information that became available after I was recording that needs to be shared with you. And that, of course, is the involvement of a former FBI agent, Jim Baker. See, he was at counsel, an assistant general counsel over at Twitter, and he left the FBI in 2018. He had to resign due to the fact that he had involvement in the Pfizer warrants for Trump, and he had involvement in the Steele dossier, a bunch of nonsense, and apparently he was screening some of the materials that were released early on in the Twitter Files, which might explain why the first chapter is underwhelming. And the second thing I want to address really quickly right off the bat is that I understand people saying we already knew that Twitter was doing this, we already knew that they were deboosting it, but there's a difference between us speculating very accurately based on the information that we have and what we can see, and us actually getting the inside information on the back end and knowing how these processes work. It's one thing for us to all feel like something is true and have solid evidence to show us it's true. It's another thing for it to be laid bare for all to see, which is why I actually think that the Twitter Files do actually have validity. They are of interest and they should be talked about. Now, there is the issue of how it's being released in threads. Thankfully, Barry Weiss's thread was much quicker than Taibbi's thread, but apparently this is a condition of them getting the materials that they release it first and foremost on Twitter. So that's the way it is. Link to the full thread in the description. But before we get into all that information about the thread, this video is sponsored. So let's go over to the sponsor and then we'll come back over here and we'll discuss this all on the other side. Apple and other companies have a long history of restricting apps from their app store and restricting information as it's displayed on search results and in other ways, depending on if you're using their software. This is one of the reasons why I highly recommend that you get a VPN, and the absolute best VPN, the VPN of this channel, is Virtual Shield. If you go over to virtualshield.com/justice, you can experience the freedom of a strict no-log VPN that's one of the top in the industry, and guess what? You can try it for free for 30 days, and there's a discount right now available to members of my audience of 73% off, and that 73% will hold for the length of your time with Virtual Shield. You can't afford to miss this deal. Go over to virtualshield.com/justice and try it out for yourself. So overall, I would say that the main theme of this thread is exactly how Twitter manipulates the algorithm and does have a bias against conservatives, which is what we all suspected all along. Now, there's some issues with some terminology that we should all get on board with, and I think it's important that you understand that they talk about things in Twitter on the back end differently from how we talk about it out there in the public. And the number one thing that I want you to take away, because it's not like it's a lot of terms, is the idea that shadow banning is something that we all say is a thing out here in the real world, but on Twitter, in the back end, what they call this is actually visibility filtering. So when they do things to make sure your tweets and your information and your narratives don't get out there, over at Twitter, they call that visibility filtration, not actually shadow banning. So they can use some forms of plausible deniability saying, well, when you call it shadow banning and we say that we're not doing that, technically that was true because we're actually visibility filtering your tweets away from your audience in order to prevent you from being seen by the majority of the people who chose to see exactly what you tweet. Now, there are a few big names in this, and one of the things that you'll notice about these big names is that they're rather mainstream. This really isn't about the alternative to the right wing, the dissident right, whatever you want to call them right now at this moment. This isn't about extremists or anything like that. This dump is largely related to mainstream conservatives and the way that Twitter tries to cut them off at the knees, and of course, the impact that this has on our discourse and on our politics. Now, before I get into who was blocked, why they were blocked, how shady it was, the techniques that they used, and why they chose those techniques rather than outright suspensions or permabans, it's important to understand the context that we're in, because a lot of lefties have been saying, while they're gaslighting you about censorship on social media, that right-wing creators grow more on social media, and they say that's proof that there is no shadow banning, there is no censorship, there is no whatever. But the thing is, most of the mainstream media is left-wing, so if 90% of what you're getting in the mainstream is left-wing, people who are conservative are looking for alternatives in order to get the information that they want to get. This is part of the issue when you have segmented out partisan media, and to be clear, I am amongst those people in the media that fill a specific niche that is counter to the mainstream. So obviously, if one group is getting their needs satisfied by the broad mainstream culture and the other isn't, on alternative platforms, that other is going to grow faster. Meaning that the fact that conservatives grow faster on social media is the cause of censorship, not evidence that the censorship isn't happening. They wouldn't need to do this if left-wing ideas were flourishing naturally on these social media platforms. So we got it. We understand that. We're clear. Let's get into who was restricted. So one of the people that were restricted was Dan Bongino. Now, you know Dan Bongino was actually banned on YouTube, but what you might not have known is that on Twitter, they were using secret techniques in order to prevent you from finding him on the platform. And the techniques are as follows. So Bongino was put on a search blacklist. And if you guys have ever searched for somebody specifically on Twitter, like me or somebody else that you wanted to find, and even when you search their full name or their full Twitter handle, in my case, it's IamSean90, and they didn't come up, this is the result of Twitter manipulating things on the back end so you don't find this person. And he's not the only person who experienced this. There was actually a doctor who also had 0 strikes, which, by the way, is very notable about Dan Bongino. It says right here he had no strikes, no marks against him, no policy violations, yet they put him on this blacklist anyway. Now, there's also somebody that you likely didn't hear of because he's not really a mainstream conservative, a doctor called Dr. Bada Chara. I apologize for the mispronunciation of the name. And the reason that he ended up not appearing in the trending server is because he was blacklisted on Twitter in terms of the trending list. So they actually have a blacklist for trending people and trending topics, and he was placed on it. But interestingly enough, the reason why he was placed on it wasn't because he was spreading misinformation or anything like that. It was because he was running contrary to the narrative, because one of the things that he put forward as an idea was the idea that the lockdowns were actually going to be way more harmful to the youth than people thought. And by the way, this turned out to be true. We see in the numbers that students who had their schools closed are falling behind significantly as compared to other students. And considering we have countries and states that had the schools open, students were doing in-class learning, and they were not significant vectors of transmission, this seemed like somebody who's putting forward a policy idea that proved out to be true, but since it went against the regime, the Democratic Party regime, because you guys remember, Trump was pushing for the opening of the schools, he was blocked from being able to trend on Twitter. But again, it's not just Bongino, it's not just this doctor. Charlie Kirk, of all people, the head of Turning Point USA, one of the most mainstream conservative organizations, about as mainstream as you can possibly get, was also messed with, according to Twitter, on the back end. Now, what they did to Charlie Kirk is essentially they put a do not amplify tag on him. And what this means, for those of you who are unaware, is that social media companies have this thing where if you're interacting with stuff, they think it's more engaging, more interesting, and they distribute it further. This is one of the reasons why people on YouTube ask you for likes, they ask you for comments, or similar, because that engagement actually means that my videos on YouTube will be presented to more people will choose to watch those videos, and then they'll subscribe, and this is how you get social media growth. Well, Twitter works in a very similar way with likes and retweets, etc. So what they actually did for Charlie Kirk, because he was growing a lot, because he's the head of one of the largest conservative organizations that pulls in about $40 million a year in donations, was tag him with a do not amplify, because they did not want his message getting out there. And one of the reasons why they did that is because Charlie Kirk was a huge Trump loyalist during the time that Trump was in office. Now, as Weiss points out, in 2018, Vijay Gadde, the head of legal policy and trust over at Twitter, and Kayvon Beckpour, the head of product, said, "We do not shadow ban." They add, "and we certainly don't shadow ban based on political viewpoints or ideology." Now again, what we call shadow banning, as Weiss points out in tweet number 7, is actually visibility filtering, so technically they're probably going to go with that explanation for why they were lying to the public so much. Now, I would love for them to release the full list of people who had their visibility shut down or had their tweets messed with in any of these ways, why they couldn't be found in searches at certain periods of time, because this would be incredibly interesting. I mean, I can speak for myself when I say that since Elon Musk took over Twitter and made some changes over at the company, my follower count, which was pretty stagnant, has ballooned significantly compared to where I was. It is undeniable that when the handcuffs were taken off, even for somebody like me who's not that big on Twitter, the growth actually came in. Also, this might have had something to do with Twitter Blue. People tend to follow people who are more verified, but I've gone over how the verification thing has been an issue for many people, and the fact that they use verification as somewhat of an endorsement and hold it over people's heads that might be deserving of it, even though they have issues with impersonation and all kinds of issues that I've talked about on this channel. So it could be a combination of the two, although I did notice a spike in people following me before Twitter Blue, but after Elon Musk took over. So take that for what it's worth. I think it's obvious, but, you know, we got to go on and we got to talk about Libs of TikTok because this is the big one. Now, Twitter had multiple tiers of moderators, and they had a team called the Site Integrity Policy Escalation Support Team. Now, this secret group within the company actually included Vijay Gadde, which is unsurprising. She's one of the chief censors, and Yoel Ross, and eventually Jack Dorsey and Parag Agrawal, who is the CEO after Dorsey, were also involved, which, by the way, is important for all the people who have said that Jack Dorsey was somehow, this was all done behind his back. And one of the Twitter accounts that was being monitored specifically by the secret group of policy moderators within the Twitter moderation structure was, of course, Libs of TikTok. Now, Libs of TikTok was already prohibited from going on trending, and this is because Libs of TikTok was going crazy. They've been mentioned by Tucker Carlson, they've been mentioned on Joe Rogan, they've had a lot of mentions because what they do is they aggregate all these different videos, mostly of teachers who are radical leftists, and they present it out to the public, and that content is just red meat for the conservative audience. Now, obviously, they don't like this. Obviously, they don't like the LGBTQ agenda being exposed to the public. So, Twitter had a situation where they needed to blacklist Libs of TikTok from the trending tab, but they also didn't want rank and file moderators taking action against them because of all the attention on Libs of TikTok's account. So what they did was essentially put a label for everybody in the lower ranks to not take action against this account. So every action, all 7 suspensions against Libs of TikTok, were actually conducted via this super moderator board that was secret within the structure of the company. Now, here's what's even more interesting about Libs of TikTok. Now, I pointed out that they've actually been suspended 7 different times from Twitter. They got 7-day bans. We all understand about these instances. However, a lot of these bans, they weren't given specific tweets, virtually none of them, as the reason why they were removed from the platform. And this is because Libs of TikTok really just aggregates content that is already allowed on social media and puts it out there, and it becomes newsworthy because it's featured on Libs of TikTok. But the thing is, I can say that, I can speculate that, you can believe that, or you can speculate other reasons why they might have been suspended. But the Twitter files make it clear that they knew on the back end that she had not violated any of the terms of service of Twitter. In fact, they were thinking of justifications or applying loose versions of their policy in order to suspend Libs of TikTok, despite the fact that they had no reason to do so. But more interestingly is what we found out is if they ever found any legitimate policy violation attached to this account, that was going to result in a perma ban. And again, if you don't believe me, just go to the thread, look at the documents. How about I just read them for you so you can understand what we're talking about? So this comes from part 19 of the thread from Barry Weiss. Now the headline is Site Policy Recommendation. Site Policy recommends placing Libs of TikTok, LTT, 1.3 million followers, not verified, in a 7-day timeout at the account level, meaning not for a specific tweet, based on the account's continued pattern of indirectly violating Twitter's hateful conduct policy by tweeting content that either leads or intends to incite harassment against individuals and institutions that support the LGBTQ communities. At this time, Site Policy has not found explicitly violative tweets, which would result in a permanent suspension of this account. This type of enforcement, repeated 7-day timeouts at the account level, will not lead to permanent suspension. However, should LTT, that's Libs of TikTok, engage in any other direct tweet level violations of any site policies, we will move forward with a permanent suspension. So there it is in plain English. They're going to continually time out Libs of TikTok so they could take them off the board temporarily, never give a justification, a specific tweet, or anything like that. Just say pattern of behavior that goes around our harassment policies or whatever. But the moment you spot an actual violation from Libs of TikTok, we're going to permaban them, because that was the plan over at Twitter. Just giving you a little bit of the inside baseball on how these social media companies work. They do target people. They do issue consequences arbitrarily, even when they know you didn't violate the terms of service if you're on the wrong side of the political spectrum. And then they wait for you to slip up so they can ban you at the drop of a hat. And what's funny is that there's a part 2 to this document that I want to read for you. And this is under the headline assessment. Since its most recent timeout, while LTT has not directly engaged in behavior violative of the hateful conduct policy, the user has continued targeting individuals, allies/supporters of the LGBTQIA+ community for alleged misconduct. The targeting of at least one of these institutions, and then unfortunately it cuts off. So what they basically do is they lay out the fact that they don't have anything on Libs of TikTok. They have no reason to ban her, but they're doing a strategy in order to get her to violate terms of service or look for any violation of terms of service, and that's when they'll permanently ban her. Then, separate from that, their assessment also agrees that she has not violated any of the terms of service. However, they decide that they're still upset about it, they're still mad about it, and the behavior is continuing, even though, again, it doesn't violate any of the rules. So, essentially what happened with Libs of TikTok is that it got so big and it got so much attention that Twitter wanted to ban it from the platform, but they couldn't, so they decided to just enforce their policy loosely, not give any specific justification, and continually, 7 different times, issue 7-day suspension. On top of that, we have internal messages on Slack, which is the internal message board of Twitter, that show Yoel Roth, who is high up in terms of content moderation, discussing how maybe deboosting instead of banning, which isn't called deboosting, again, it's visibility filtration, and other methods like locking people's tweets are more effective than bans, and they should do that going forward. He essentially directs people at Twitter's research team to come up with the research to determine if this is more effective, because he says the problem is people disseminating information they don't like, not necessarily their accounts being in existence. So essentially what these social media companies were moving towards is that you get to end up on the platform, you get to exist on the platform, we just cut off your reach or significantly limit your reach, so that way you have no impact. That way you can't complain that you're being banned. All we're doing is filtering your visibility. Also, something that I found really interesting is that the attack against Libs of TikTok, the issue that they say that they have with her, is the fact that she's doing things that lead to the targeted harassment in the real world of people in the LGBTQ community, hospitals, or whatever. But it actually shows in the documents how petty Twitter was, because when the home address of Libs of TikTok was put out in the public on Twitter, they took no action to remove the tweet despite it being reported, despite it clearly being a violation of their doxing policy, and despite the fact that it had a ton of interaction. So while Twitter was doing everything and anything to look for ways to suspend, deboost, block from trending, and or ban eventually Libs of TikTok, they wouldn't even lift a finger in the simplest instance in order to protect her. Now again, I know a lot of people are going to say, we suspected this. This is something that we're not surprised by, and all of that is true. But now we have the documents, now we have the internal communications, and I'm hoping that at some point, a list of each and every account that had their visibility featured, that was blocked from trending, that have the do not amplify tags on them, come out into the public so we can see the extent of the manipulation from behind the scenes over at these social media companies. It is one thing to suspect something. It is one thing to have strong suspicion of something and have evidence from the outside, but now we're getting a peek behind the curtain. We're getting a look at the engine. We understand how it works, and while it is exactly how we suspected in one part, it's also something that cannot be denied and you can't be gaslit about anymore. These platforms are biased against conservatives. They look for reasons to ban your ideas from their platforms, and we should all take note of these tech giants who have been granted power and immunity that coordinate with the Democratic Party in order to suppress opposition speech. But hey, those are just my thoughts, so let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social media, support me via the support links in the description box of this video. This has been me talking about the Twitter files part 2. Till next time.